Okay, we should start. I'll minimize this. Yes. Good. So what we're going to do today is we're going to try to apply what we discussed last week onto a larger social domain, which is science. And we will be dealing with something that's called science of science. So the scientific attempt at understanding science. First, though, I will be presenting a brief recap of the Scrabble stuff. Uh, I haven't received plots from you, so I made some very quick plots to show what happens so you don't have the suspense. Uh, then we will be moving into the science of science, and we will be discussing how do we think of science as teamwork? How do we conceptualize performance and similarity in performance? What is diversity in science? And should we also think about these interactional or communication costs of diversity that we discussed? All of these leading to what we're going to do on Friday, which is try to do a mocap brainstorm and maybe operationalization of possible projects, exam-like projects that would start from these questions. So we've seen that from what we know of social cognition and the idea of information integration, right, we can learn a way of looking at teamwork that gives us an operational grasp, that allows us to ask questions that have sometimes been asked, sometimes not been asked, but at least we can actually use that to guide systematic research. We have seen that diversity is a good thing when the problem is complex enough, right? So that we can control each other's errors. We can make available different sort of informations that would not be there. And we can employ different strategies in searching for solutions, different styles of exploration. And when there's a trade-off, and that there is a trade-off between informational and interactive dynamics. So it's not enough to have diverse information available. We need to be able to express, accept, and integrate others' information, and didn't write it there, but also integrate means criticize in a non-obstructive way. And again, I'm just reminding you of the different points that we cover so we have them fresh for analyzing science. We tried to see some of these dynamics at work in the Scrabble experiment, right? I know not everybody likes the Scrabble task. It doesn't matter what the task is. It's just a way of trying to ask this question and giving you a template on how we could do that. So we're measuring individual performance in constrained word generation. We were measuring joint performance in constrained word generation, and then again, individual performance. And that was because we wanted to ask questions like, are groups really better than individuals? And what drives collective benefits if it's there, right? Or variation in joint performance if collective benefit is not there? And does then having performed together, right? The slight paradox of we need, in principle, diversity to perform well, but does then interacting decrease this diversity that we see? So this is how collective benefit works. The plot is not super obvious because I whipped it up very quickly, but in blue, we see the ratio between the joint performance of your pairs and the best of the two, blue, sorry, and the average of the two individuals that were part of that group at round one. So what, and the vertical line is how much, well, sorry, it's the one ratio of one that is if the group is just as good as the average of the two individuals, right? I didn't do tests. I could have done that. But what we see is that most pairs, right, perform right at that level or slightly above. There's a funny tale, like there's a couple of pairs that perform much better than the average individual. So there is a lot of variability. In red is a stricter test of the collective benefit. That is the group better than the best of the two individuals, right? And what we see here is that by far most pairs, except the same two on the right, actually didn't perform better than the best of the two individuals, right? So a strict test of a strong benefit of collaboration in this specific context with the constraints of the experiments didn't work, right? Does that make sense? So of course we could ask, is that because your class was very bad at doing that? Should we check what the other classes did in previous years? And what we see is that the pattern is actually more or less the same, right? At least half of the pairs don't perform. Maybe I should explain. On the x-axis, there's the cohort, right? The 17, 18 cohorts, the 21 and 22 cohorts. And on the y-axis is, again, this ratio between the joint performance and the best of the two individuals, with one being joint performance being exactly the same as the best of the two individuals. And you can see that the median in those box plots is consistently below the best of the two individuals, meaning that at least half of the pairs perform worse than the best of the two individuals. But we can see that there's actually, as usual, also as here, some pairs that perform much better, right? So there is no clear collective benefit from collaborating in this on average, but we can see that there is at least enough variation that we could start looking at the source of this variation. I could have also discussed something with one of you last week. I could have also made an even stricter test. What if we take not just the performance of the best of the two individuals, but the merged list of their words at round one? That is an artificially combined joint performance of the two individuals. And I didn't even represent it because it was kind of dismal, right? If we do that in this specific task with this specific setup, and we can discuss whether there are constraints there, right? The pairs are not as good as just automatically merging the individual production. This is actually, if you go back to the Optimal Interactive Minds line of papers that we discussed last week, there is an answer that was published, I think, about a year after in Science, in which Israeli researcher made exactly the same point with the Interactive Minds paradigm, saying, what if instead of having people interact, we actually just have the computer pair their answer and pick one? Would we still gain that benefit? We don't need to interact, right? We just need some sort of collating, aggregation of the data. In that case, in a follow-up to the follow-up paper, we were able to show that actually interaction helps. In this case, who knows, right? It's interesting to know when these things work, when they don't. Second is, does similarity in performance predict collective benefit? And here I was too quick, so I, by mistake, put in also round 3, which we don't care. So let's only look at the dark line. And we see that the more similar the participants are in their performance level, the higher the collective benefit, right? Again, we don't care about significance here. We're just looking at trends because we're not publishing a study, right? However, I don't know, anybody notice that about that plot? Right, the slope is really driven by this, right? If we were doing proper statistics, I would use a student t likelihood so that that wouldn't affect things. This doesn't mean that those two pairs are not interesting. Those two pairs are very interesting. They're actually part of the manipulation that I made. They're the pairs that should have performed best. Woohoo! But it's hard to make an inference from two, right? So we need to explore them more qualitative, but also be very careful on making any strong inference. If we look at previous years, again, we get very similar patterns where there is a slight positive relation between similarity and collective benefit, but nothing very strong. Does that make sense? Good. Then we want to see whether lexical diversity, which now I had turned into lexical similarity, is related to collective benefit. And what we can see is that, again, due to my silly mistake, I saw something weird, right? That if we look at lexical similarity in round 3, we see that the more similar the participants have become, the more collective benefit they had gained, the better they had collaborated. So rephrasing it in a temporal sequence, I'm not saying causal, but at least temporal, the better people collaborated, the more similar they became after. You can also see that the range of values at round 1 and round 3 are not completely overlapping. Like there is a clear shift towards high lexical similarity in the third round. Also, we see a very weak trend that perhaps the less similar, the better the collective benefit, but I wouldn't trust that for anything, right? So we can look at how the previous years look like. And again, we get a lot of variability. There's some years where we would be tempted to see a predicted negative trend, right? The more similarity, the less collective benefit. The more lexical similarity, the less collective benefits. But there's also like the trends are very weak, and there is 1 year, 22, that is just completely flat, right? Then I looked at whether you had become better from round 1 to round 3, and that seems also to happen, right? Clearly, there is a very strong need, if these had to be a proper study, for a baseline, right? That checks for how individuals would get better over time. We can look at lexical similarity, which increases quite strongly, not for everybody, but generally. So that means that if we take, yes, if we take the same 2 individuals that collaborated in round 2 and check their lexical similarity at round 1 and their lexical similarity at round 3, they have become much more similar, right? If we look at performance similarity, there is a very weak trend, which I wouldn't trust for anything, but it goes slightly up, right? People become slightly more similar in their performance, but you can see that it's a bimodal distribution, right? You can see that there is most pairs become better, or at least slightly, or not worse. And then there's a group of 3 pairs that is doing exactly the opposite, where the performance is collapsing. And again, with these numbers, we can really say something, but that's also something that we should be exploring if these were a real study and saying, okay, we can see that the population is heterogeneous. There is something different here. Let's go and check the logs. Let's go and check the words. Let's try to figure out if there is some interesting systematic difference there that could be explored in a follow-up study, right? Good. So, overview, we didn't get really collective benefit for everybody, only for somebody. I was checking the time logs in the data, and I suspect that the 7 minutes limit was not really reached by a lot of peers or by individuals. And I suspect that there is a lot of interactional costs in having to have only one person that's typing in and cannot keep on perseverating in their own sequence of associations, but has to keep track also of the others, sometimes taking turns, and so on and so forth. I had put a 7 minutes limit so that maybe an individual can write much faster for 3 minutes and a half, but then loses ability to find more things. And 2 people can then sort of pick up that, but in this case, it didn't work, right? So there's something also that one could work on, the timing of the experiment and the instructions on how to use this time. We see that the performance similarity is a much stronger effect than diversity, but they're highly correlated, right? That's why I had made the manipulation of the different pairs. Again, splitting things by pairs, the results are not very much better, so we probably need more data. And then we can see that by collaborating, lexical diversity decreases and performance similarity marginally increase. So that there are at least immediate effects of the collaboration also on individual performance. How long it lasts, that's another big question. Final thing that I brought up in class last week is that we're not really but when we just look at the performance and the number of words, we're not really exploring the mechanisms underlying what's going on. And so what I did is I created networks of how these words are related, for instance, in edit space or in phonetic space or in semantic space. And then we can describe the trajectories of individuals versus the other member of the pair versus the pair in this space. And what we can see, even if, again, the data are very weak, is that the area covered by pairs is slightly larger than the area covered by individuals. But there's a lot of stuff that could be done there. So this was just to say that we can learn something about teamwork. It's very limited to a specific task, and we were limited by study design, by pairs, but it should give you some input on how to design experiments in this space. For instance, you could take any other task that you'd think interesting to explore in this context and work on that. Did you check the exam paper from last week? Right? You can have a look. That's exactly an example of these kind of things. You could imagine doing it online at a larger scale, or do a better, more controlled setups to explore these hypotheses, right? And proper counterbalance things. You could model the underlying networks and exploitation dynamics. And there's a couple of papers that I think would actually be a good different orthogonal ways of exploring these issue, which one is about how inspired by how animals forage together, and the other is inspired by how the network of words that children learn is actually growing according to network properties, right? So you tend to learn next the word that is more connected to the word to hypothesis, that is more central in the network of adult speech, that is more connected to the words that you already know in the network of adult speech, right? You could also, I know that some of you have expressed interest for a more qualitative kind of analysis, but you could also record and analyze a small sample of interactions in these kind of setups and relate them to differences in collective benefits, right? You could also ask them, for instance, I think that I was brainstorming on my own, say, oh, now you're doing it 5 times, and in between each time that you're doing it as a pair, right, you should discuss how you're going to solve it next time. So that actually there is a sort of metacognitive, explicit representation of the strategy used that you can take with some caution and analyze how different pairs are developing different styles of exploring this. Good. Are there questions on that? Yep. I'm just going to put my mobile here so I can check the time. Perfect. Yes, so now we want to go from these kind of way of looking at teamwork to science. I want you to take, well, let's take 1 minute first alone, right? To think about the following question, and then we'll take 8 minutes together or in pairs to discuss it, and then we'll take it public. Actually, maybe 8 minutes is too much. Let's say 5 minutes. So the first thing is that in which sense or in which senses we could characterize science and as teamwork. I expect you to have read some of the readings, but it's not needed to answer these questions, right? Because we've discussed what teamwork is, and you've gone through 2 years of cognitive science, so you know a bit about what science is, right? Which kinds of similarity and diversity can be found in science and how they could benefit science? Whether science fits the definition of problem that could benefit from diversity? What could be possible interactional or communicative costs of science? And as you discuss this point, try to keep in mind that we might want to investigate these topics in exam papers, or at least in the mock-up brainstorming on Friday. Right? So focus on easier to study aspects versus very demanding issues. So for instance, if you think, oh, we should go and do deep interviews with everybody working on social learning, right? And try to figure out, or we should spend 6 months in a science lab to do these and that. That's very good research, but it's not necessary. It's not something that would be fit for an exam paper. So we keep that as the scope. So take 1 minute to think on these topic on your own, and then after that minute, I'll give you a signal to spend 5 minutes in pairs. Okay, so we'll now take 10 minutes, and then after the break, we will go through a bunch of research that has already been done that I try to sort of put into the pigeonhole of the structure and some of the questions that can be asked to that. And we should start. Uh, so what we're going to do now is we're going to do a quick review of a field that has coalesced with the name the science of science, where I'm mostly combining references from chapters of this book, The Science of Science by Wang and Barabashi, and from the readings with some extra stuff. Right? But we're going to try to build it as in the framework of science as teamwork. So in the paper, The Science of Science by Fortunato et al., that some of you might have read, they say that science can be described as a complex, self-organizing, and evolving network of ideas, projects, papers, and scholars. And perhaps I would add, we can actually add impact, for instance, policies, patents, people that move between science, industry, and services, right? And the paper then says that it is aimed at a quantitative understanding of the genesis, so the origin of scientific discovery, creativity, and practice, and at developing tools and policies aimed at accelerating scientific progress. which is a very technocratic vision of science of science. It's not wrong necessarily, but it's very technocratic. How do we accelerate it? More papers, right? So I have some quibbles with this definition, which is that as a quantitative scientist myself, I would always argue that we should not forget qualitative and conceptual, also because a pure quantitative approach often ends up gravitating to the easy stuff to measure and not necessarily to the goal. The second is that accelerating scientific progress is an expression that's fraught with potential issues, right? I think we all agree that if we could cure Alzheimer tomorrow, that would be a really good thing, right? If we develop more and more cures for cancer, I'm all for it. But accelerating scientific progress can be misinterpreted in many ways, right? We don't want more papers. We don't want more citations. We don't want more patents, right? We don't want more laws, policies, things. We actually want better and more solid ones, right? And that's also something that we shouldn't forget in this quantitative thing. In the paper, the Fortunato et al. Also say that science of science is taking its methods from a series of disciplines, from scientometrics, which is something that has been developed in policy studies and in library studies to measure things in the scientific output, right? It takes the idea of measuring science from large-scale data sources, right? So for instance, if you were working at Google and could get access to the Google Scholar database, hooray. There's alternative open source ones like Semantic Scholar. There used to be a fantastic data set created by Microsoft. Now the name escapes me, but where a large amount of papers had been collected and then metadata had been added to them. I can find the name if you want. From sociology of science, it takes its theory, theoretical concepts, and the idea of social processes that are involved in science. And from innovation studies, it explores and identifies pathways through which science contributes to invention and economic change. Right? It uses methods that, on top of that, hail from descriptive statistics and data visualization to advanced econometric methods, network science approaches, machine learning algorithms, mathematical analysis, and computer simulations, including agent-based modeling, which we do in 3 weeks, 2 weeks of classes. Also, I peppered the lecture with the word network, right, as a hint for next week. And again, I think that this is a decent definition, but it's sort of forget that there's a lot of really cool philosophy that we can use for conceptual and theoretical frameworks. And so from Kuhn to Lakatos, Feuerabend, but actually contemporary work in philosophy of science tends to be much more applied than that. You have people like, well, Hazok Chang is sort of questioning a lot of the ideas like measurement and so on. But we have people like Kevin Zollman and Kaylin O'Connor and Jim Weatherall that are building citation analysis of how ideas spread in science and agent-based simulation to simulate and understand, at least in silico, right, in a controlled environment, how different policies and dynamics can actually give rise to different patterns in science. There's really cool stuff in science and technology studies, starting from Latour, Science in Action, which is like a classic in how science is produced using concepts, but also material tools. And there's lots of really cool contemporary work. For instance, you should look at stuff by Evan Fleece that is trying to understand how the science reform movement that has arisen as an answer to the credibility crisis is sort of building their perspective, right? And we should get out of the metrics obsession for metrics' sake, right? I think metrics are good. We should always try to keep in mind that science is not about a paper with a million citations. It's a paper with an idea that changes the way we think, right? So how is teamwork conceptualized? We've went through that, but there's science as teamwork in the sense of the research group that works. Here we see a paper called The Increasing Dominance of Teams in Production of Knowledge that shows how across different fields, the proportion of non-solo authored papers has increased over time. So you can see on the left a panel that goes from the 50s up to 2000, where in patents, in science and engineering, and in social sciences, the proportion of non-solo authored papers rises almost to 50% for all of them, and in humanities it stays flat. Another way in which these science is increasing teamwork is that not only the number of teams producing science is growing compared to the number of isolated individuals producing science, but that the size of these groups is actually changing drastically. In this other paper, Principle of Scientific Research Team Formation and Evolution, we can see light blue plot of the proportion of teams that have different sizes. We can see that the team size falls pretty quickly, right? So you get that the biggest teams in the period 61 to 65 are around 10 people, right? In physics. Then we can look on the right, the red line, which is the period between 2006 and 2010, which is not on the right because it's later in time, but it's on the right because the compositions of team is actually much larger at later stage. So what's happening here is that, especially in certain branches of physics, we have a necessity, right? There's increasing cost and complexity of tools and knowledge involved. So not only the particle accelerator, but for instance, if you're, I took away that reference. I'm going to reintroduce it. If you're the kind of nerd that cares about gravitational waves, right, there is this machine called the LIGO, which has been developed for like 30 years before they could even take the first measurements. And it's a very sensitive apparatus that is able to measure how two, I think it was it two black holes or two neutron stars rotating, two black holes rotating, the one close to the other, send waves that compress and expand the space-time continuum, right? So they're actually changing the gravity spreading throughout the universe. And it took forever and a lot of funding and a lot of people, even just so that, somebody would keep working on the machines when the early people retired, right? But also in cognitive science, we have increasing concerns about, can we really do a study on 20, 15-month-old Danish kids from academic parents and claim that we figure out development in human beings, right? Not only 15 is very little, or 20, I can remember how much I said, but also we need diversity represented, diversity of participants represented, and that requires a large network of people involved, right? Think about neuroimaging. It's the same issue, right? If you want to collect 500 participants, either you have a humongous grant or you want different labs collaborating, right? And then everybody can contribute their paradigm, so you can actually get right? Each their study to a certain extent on 500 participants, which starts having the density of sampling that's required by some of the more nuanced analysis, right? Or others are, there's the many primate study where we want to understand how primates think, do stuff, and it takes forever to run studies on 5 chimpanzees in Leipzig and 10 or 2 bonobos in Leiden and so on and so forth. I'm part of one of those studies and it's crazy, but you need a lot of efforts to do this. There's also, oh, I did something wrong with the animations. The increased awareness of replicability and generalizability issues. But if we remember these early plots, really, except for physics and some extreme papers, what's happening is that the solo authoring is disappearing, not that just great big teams are emerging. And so there is the idea of, by combining diverse competences, we can integrate established knowledge with novel insight, right? Which are often old insights in other fields. Do you know the story of deep reinforcement learning and Montezuma? So there was a group, I think it was a DeepMind, they were developing a deep reinforcement learning machine that would play Atari games, right? And they had a suite of, let's say, 50 something games that they want to play. I can't remember how many. And the game was on average beating the average player, and after a while, even beating the best player. Right? These algorithms, as you know, they take all the pixels on the screen, they get no previous information, and then they learn from, I don't know, the score that increases in the game, that certain responses to combinations of pixels might increase the score, right? The authors publish this paper, right? A computer, a deep neural network can play the Atari games better than any computer gamer, etc. And then they don't report it in the paper, so maybe they had looked at that, or maybe they didn't, and they discover it later. They go and check at the single games, and they see that Montezuma Revenge was a game in which the algorithm was just absolute crap. And so they try to figure out what's going on. And apparently what's happening is that you play the screen of the first level of Montezuma Revenge, and actually you don't get points for the first 3 screens, right? It's like a stupid platformer where you really need to get far in order to get points. And that was sort of escaping the ability of the algorithm to get there by chance. They talked about this at some conference, and a developmental psychologist went there and says, well, of course, because that's not how children learn. The way that children learn is that they don't just get reward for, the hug or the candy that you're giving them. They get reward because something unexpected has happened, right? And that created a collaboration. They tweaked the algorithm so that it would get reward even just for seeing a new combination of pixels that it hadn't seen before. And suddenly the algorithm was able to solve the Montezuma Revenge. So it was an insight that was kind of well established in developmental psychology, but had completely escaped the billion-dollar enterprise at DeepMind to develop these algorithms. So stuff about Internet allows us to coordinate much more easily, right? So I have collaborations around the world with people that I've never even met because somebody read one of my papers and said, could you please run the same analysis on my data? And then I say, well, I'm a bit busy, and they just run the analysis, we'll do everything else, right? And then I get an extra paper on that. There are also economists, as usual, who are conceptualizing these in terms of pure self-interest, right? If I write a paper on my own, I get 1 paper, and Valeria writes a paper on her own, she gets 1 paper, right? She might get 10 citations on that paper, she gets 10 citations, I get 5, but if we Basically, well, in medicine, it would be if we just put each other's name on each other paper, or if we actually build a bit of a collaboration, we suddenly have 2 papers and 15 citations each, right? Which is a competitive edge on somebody who has only done solo authoring. Also, people tend to self-cite a lot. So if it's 2 of us on the paper, right, any future paper that Valeria is going to write will also cite my paper that I co-authors with her. And the same, I will publish additional papers alone further, and I will cite more paper by Valeria, right? Because my name is on them. So, however, there are actually costs. It's not just an incentive thing. So if you collaborate, right, there are some interactional costs, which means that you will tend to have fewer first author paper, which are often at the beginning of your career a way of getting a job or a grant. And there's risks of blind alleys, right? So if we just pull everybody together in a field and we write a paper together, we sort of corral everybody in one direction. And there's a reference there to readings that if you read, great, you get it. If you haven't, now you have a cue for going and reading them. But also, it seems that there are hidden costs of these team playing, teamwork on papers, which are different by different socio-demographic strata. There's been a terrible and really nicely done study on economists, where what they did is they tried to assess how the number of solo author papered and the number of co-author papered affected the probability of getting tenure, that is, of getting a job that is not time limited. And what they found was that when women write, well, actually, that when men write solo papers or co-author papers, it doesn't matter. Just the N of papers count for their probability of getting tenure, right? So when they co-author a paper, their contribution to that paper is considered to be big enough that that paper can be considered theirs. When a female economist collaborates with one or more male economists, her tenure prospects don't improve, right? When a woman in that specific field collaborates to a paper, her contribution is not considered substantial enough to count for tenure, right? And the effect is so dramatic that this single variable, the fraction of solo author paper, can explain most of the gender differences in tenure outcomes in the United States in the period studied, right? Which is kind of a very stark cost of collaboration, not being considered, not having your contribution considered because somebody else is more prominent on that. It's actually a very big problem in these large many labs collaborations where we say, okay, right, we want to know whether infants really prefer infant-directed speech instead of adult-directed speech. And you have labs around the world that start collaborating and collecting data, but who ends up being first and last author, right? It's not the PI of the lab in Ghana who's collaborating. And I'm picking Ghana because it's a low resource environment on average, right? It's usually, I'm part of one of those collaborations, so I'm going to say like Princeton and Stanford who get the first and the last, right? Which means that, of course, the different labs will get advances in science, potentially. They will get more citations, etc., but they will not get the credit for these large enterprises. Another way of thinking of science as teamwork is by looking at citation networks, right? This is a study on papers that try to find vocal markers of schizophrenia. That is atypicality in voice structure that can predict the presence of schizophrenia or not in a person. And we can see each of the nodes is a paper, And each of the connections is how similar the references that those papers have in their bibliography is. And what we can see is that clearly there's at least 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 separate teams in that field, right? Where they cite each other, they cite the same references, they're building a scientific discourse, which is completely separated from the others, right? And then we can discuss whether that's a good or a bad thing for the field. But it's not necessarily the same thing when we look at similar papers in the studies attempting to identify vocal markers of autism. And there we can see that there was a macro cluster of 4 different clusters, but all citing each other, a separate cluster that is doing something slightly different, and then a few isolates, right? The information flows in very different ways in these 2 fields, even if they're studying something that's actually very similar, right? Though the study of schizophrenia is a more medicalized context, right? The study of autism is a more educational, developmental context, and that has a lot of impact, but that's a different story. Another way of looking at teamwork, and this is a fantastic and scary paper called How Citation Distortions Create Unfounded Authority, Analysis of Citation Network. Do you know anything about the beta amyloid hypothesis about Alzheimer? Some of you do. But basically, there's been in the last 20, 30 years a big push for recognizing that beta amyloid is a protein that accumulates in brain of patients who develop Alzheimer, and perhaps it's one of the causes of Alzheimer, creating these plaques on, I can't remember which part of the neurons, but whatever. And this has been a very successful and very well-established hypothesis. And then somebody starts saying, maybe we can also find them in, and I should have written it down. Did I write it down? No. In another motor disorder, right? And so they published a paper showing some of these effects. And then these became a nicely established theory with some support in the field, to the point that it started draining resources that would otherwise be used to fund alternative research in the field. Greenberg got suspicious by some stuff he saw in the paper, and he started analyzing what happened. So he saw that what happened was that one lab did one study, which, by the way, had doctored images. Then the very same team started doing 6 other studies in which they cite the first paper, in which partially they reuse the same data and doctored images. And at the same time, other groups are trying to test that hypothesis. They do a study, they get no results. They don't see any extra beta amyloid in the neural tissues, and they don't publish anything anymore, right? What happens then is the 6 follow-up papers to the first lab sort of create a snowball effect. And given that there are so many papers citing that first paper, given that there are so many papers finding these results, the results spread out in the literature. And in this paper, Greenberg also tries to run a simulation in which it says, what if those 6 papers hadn't happened, right? How would the information spread in the literature? And then he finds that there wouldn't have been this gateway into meta-analysis and systematic reviews that really legitimized the story. Funnily enough, when I was rereading this paper while preparing the class today, I had just finished reading this book about the beta amyloid hypothesis in Alzheimer, which basically is a very well-researched, a bit boring, but very well-researched journalistic investigation in exactly the same kind of dynamics in Alzheimer, where again, the whole beta amyloid hypothesis is actually just a fraud. But there's something on the lines of $4 to $5 trillion that have been invested in investigating it and making clinical trials. So this kind of bad teamwork, right, was very effective for a while. Another way of looking at the teamwork was the work by Sarah and Frida a few years ago on their exam here. And that was one of the papers that I added as exam papers. And they were interested in how does information flow across studies when we have realistic situation like not all studies get published because people, find an old result or something happens. Not all studies happen in a neat sequence, right? It's not like you do a study, then I do a study, then a third person does a study, but there are several labs at the same time working. And not all studies know all previous studies, right? Something like in these situations, right? If we give a generous reading, those isolate up there, they just happen to be outsiders coming into the field, publishing a paper, but they really didn't know the rest of the literature. And so they said, well, let's simulate a situation where we have a transmission chain where study 1 happens, then study 2 knows what happened in study 1 and publishes a new study, and so on and so forth until study 19. And let's then compare that to a real network of papers. So we picked, there's a meta lab, that's a website where there's a bunch of meta-analysis. We picked a specific meta-analysis, and then we looked at the citation network of the papers in that meta-analysis. So we have a well-defined domain, all papers working on the same topic, and we can see where the information goes along the citation network. And that was a bit messy. So what happens is these kind of effects, right? As a study happens, it doesn't necessarily cite the previous study, but it might cite a selection of previous studies, right? And these replicates exactly the flow of citation as that network that I've seen before. We also have publication bias, right? So some papers don't get published, and those are the red ones. So actually study 3 cannot study 2 because study 2 never gets published, and therefore cites study 1. And when we look at the citation network, this is also something like that. Yes, good. So what then they were doing is they checked in this simulation if we use the previous study result as a prior for the analysis in the current study, how does the estimate approximate or not the true value that we can set up in the simulation when the network of citation is linear, when the network of citation is linear, but some papers are not published, when the network of citation is a true network with or without publication bias. On the left panel, you can see on the y-axis, 0 is a difference of 0 from the true effect in the simulation. And the different dots are different studies. And we can see that in the linear condition, right, the yellow and red, after, 15 studies, they get as good as they can close to the true effect. And when we have the citation network with and without publication bias, we get a systematic bias, right? So the fact that we don't know all the studies, the fact that there are these network effects of clusters, in these cases is actually keeping the estimate further away from the true effect. But we also get a nice index or hint that things might not be good because the uncertainty is actually quite high. And I just wanted to put these in, even if I'm not explaining all the details, but because I wanted to cover that exam paper. And one of the things that I think was cool in that paper was that they managed to figure out a good way of quantifying the flow of information, but it was also very reductive. It was estimates of an effect. And I think that there's much more to be explored in terms of how ideas flow through this network of citations. Okay, then how do we measure performance when we look at science, given that we have focused on performance in the teamwork? There's many dominant views. For instance, if we look at people, some approaches quantify how many papers they produce, which journal they publish, right? How many citations they get, which is especially used as a measure of importance or performance of a paper, and or the number of grants that a person or a paper generates. And there's some stuff here, but I'm actually gonna go further and say there have been attempts to move a bit beyond that. If you remember last week, we tried to avoid just counting words as a measure of performance because different words might be differently difficult, right? And different niche topics might be differently popular, so might generate different amount of citations. And there's all sort of other ways in which other component can affect how many citations or how many paper a person generates. There is these paper by Roberta Sinatra at Copenhagen University these days on quantifying the evolution of individual scientific impact that tried to say, actually, let's try to move away just from the amount of citation. And let's try to measure the latent ability. And the model basically says that after 10 years, that's where the 10 comes from, the number of citation of a paper I for person A, paper A for person I, is given by two factors. One is Q, the latent ability, and the other is P, that is how many papers that person has published, or that's the other equation. But basically, it says that assuming that the number of citation of a paper after 10 years depends on luck and the ability of the scientist to create an impactful paper, normalized by field and adjusted for productivity, because if I publish 100 papers compared to 10 papers, not only will I cite myself more, but I will also create that snowball effect that we've seen before. Then we can calculate these Q, which avoids inflating older scientists who have published more at longer time from publication and deflating younger ones. And these can be used, for instance, it's not that difficult to calculate. They had even a Shiny app at a certain point online. I couldn't find it last night, but maybe it's still there. It's a good way of saying if we want to test ideas of similarities, we can use this measure of different scientists and then see how well their joint paper performs. I also had a quick quibble, as usual, that one of the things that we decided at AU when evaluating people we need to hire is that we should stay away from using journal, in which journal you published, and how many papers you publish. But we put a filter where we said, as you apply, you need to submit, let's say for an assistant professorship, 5 papers and only 5 papers. You need to attach the PDF. And the committee that's evaluating you has to read those 5 papers and comment on those. And depending on the head of the committee, if it's me, you're not supposed to comment on how many other papers have been published. But that doesn't happen all the time. which I think is a way of moving away from the metrics. I just wanted to balance a bit that. Approaches to diversity, what has the field done? Well, let's focus on gender and ethnic diversity, which are popular and easy because often you can just try to reconstruct it from the names in the author list, which has a lot of biases, but there you go. Institutional and international diversity, which again is easy because it's part of the affiliations of the authors of a paper. There's also some attempts at quantifying cognitive diversity as defined by Scott Page, and that's harder, so it's been done to a lesser extent. Some try to look at the discipline or department in which the scholar is working, which I find it very bad, perhaps because I grew up in a very heterogeneous setup, but the three people who were sharing an apartment with me during my PhD and did the same PhD as me. So we share a lot of background and we can think the same way. One is working at a food science in an agrary science department, another in a design department, and the third in a communication department working on football, right? But then there's people who do level of experience. There's history of collaboration. If you collaborated a lot, we assume that you're not that diverse, right? So your next paper together shouldn't be as impactful if we think that diversity is impactful as two people who have never collaborated together. And then there's an attempt at doing topic or semantic analysis, mostly of the abstract or only titles of the papers. And so there's a few attempts at seeing whether these kinds of diversity affect the impact of a paper. And they show that if the paper is written by authors with more than one ethnicity in their combination, you get 5 to 10% more citations. If there's international diversity, there's 5-10% more citations. If it's their institutional diversity, I had a hard time finding the exact estimate, but it says that it's more highly cited work compared to teaming up with someone down the corridor. Somebody wrote a critical paper saying, could these be open-mindedness? If you collaborate with somebody, right, it's because you're open-minded. If you're open-minded, with somebody diverse, sorry, it means you're open-minded. If you're open-minded, you're also a better scientist. There's nothing in the collaboration that makes it more impactful. And there's been a study referred in the next click where they then actually check the same authors when publishing with non-diverse co-authors or when diverse co-authors, whether there is a difference in the impact. And that seems to point to the fact that there is no open-mindedness compound. It's actually the collaboration that does that. And those are the papers that I use to compile that. This is also a paper that's trying to do it all at once. So to control whether these different effects are confounded with each other. But we don't have much time. So I'm going to be moving to the next slide, which is, could diversity be hindering as well, as we discussed? And again, there is what I would call a causal inference issue, which you might be covering in terms of colliders in methods 4, or computational methods, that's published papers might have more citations if you have a diverse setup, but not all research gets published or even done, right? We had a similar case that was a couple of years, last year actually, a big discussion about gender bias in hiring at Aarhus University, where somebody made a quick analysis and showed that amongst the applicants to a job position at Aarhus University, a woman would have a higher probability of getting hired than a man. And that created a bit of a discussion as to would these be a case of sexism and discrimination, right? And we could discuss forever, the fact that things have to be taken into account in the history of discrimination and that, etc. But an alternative explanation that can reproduce exactly that pattern is that if it's harder to apply and to publish for women or group X, right, then those women who will apply for that job will be on average more qualified than the average man who applies, right? The same is here, right? So if it takes a lot for diverse, ethnically diverse, gender diverse, internationally diverse studies to be published because there's a lot of interactional costs, because there is very well established prejudice in peer review and so on and so forth, then it might be that those that are published actually get more citation because they went through a stricter filter. It's not just that they're generally better, but it's that only a few of them gets published, right? Does it make sense? These are the kind of things that we need to worry when we do observational research. We cannot change the setup of research teams. We need to observe what happens in the field. And so there's a couple of studies that tried to quantify that, and they show that diverse teams tend to have more rejected grants, right? Meaning that sometimes they don't even get to run the study. Meaning that there's a very likely selective pressure there. It has to be really good to persuade the grant agency, right? And then, of course, it might get more citations. It has also a lower mean of publication per grant, which might suggest that either there are interactional costs that make a difference or that it's harder to publish the paper, right? Or both. And that the larger the team is, the bigger these risks are. I'm going a bit fast and I apologize. I just want to wrap up before you need to go home. Can we actually quantify more directly cognitive diversity? Because I don't know about you, but when we talk about diversity as gender, ethnicity, nationality, age, right, they're proxies, right? They're telling us something important, but I really want to see the mechanism, right? I don't want to just say, including diverse people is good because diversity, but I want to say, actually, look, here are how diverse the ideas that are produced are, right? Here is how different the spread of information is. And there's this cool paper that I put in your reading list for today, which is trying to compare small teams and big teams in science, right? And they use a theoretical model that says if a paper is disruptive, it's not disruptive, is very, building up and conventional, right? That's the central one, D -1. We have that paper, cites a lot of old papers, the top ones. And when new papers, the red ones, cite that paper, they also cite the old papers. Right, so it's building on the existing knowledge and adding to that. We have and when a paper is instead disruptive, let's take the extreme case, right? Here on the right, we have that paper cites a bunch of paper, but when new papers come out, they don't cite the old paper. These paper has created a new reference point, right? It's very disruptive in the field. And what they were showing is that if you have a small group, then you tend to disrupt more, to create more new reference points. When you have a large group, you tend to actually add to the knowledge. Right? Again, this is very abstract away from ideas. So that's where the very last slide I want to make sure I cover comes in. there's actually papers that have tried to quantify the ideas and the impact they have. On the left, there's the Hofstra paper, the diversity paradox, which tried to take the key concepts from all a subset of, I think it was 200 PhD theses, and look at how these concepts are related to each other. Then it identified innovation as a novel link between two concepts that were not connected before. For instance, in the Lillian Branch PhD dissertation in '87, right? She connected HIV and monkey for the first time. Or Kenneth Winsler, glioblastoma and molecular, right? So they're creating new structures. And what the paper shows is that minority individuals in a field, which could be women in physics, it could be men in educational research, right? Tend to produce more of these novel links. However, these novel links tend to spread more if they're produced by the majority person, right? Meaning that there's more innovation, but it doesn't resonate. The paper, of course, doesn't quantify whether these were good novel links or bad novel links. That's a different thing, but it's a start of the problem. Another way that looks things that are closer to modern LLMs, even if it's using topic modeling here, it's looking at which discourses resonate in the debates of the French Revolution in the novel established French Parliament. And it's trying to quantify, given a vector representation of a speech, how surprising it is given the past and how surprising it is given the future. That is, how novel it is compared to the past. And if it's novel compared to the future, then it doesn't resonate. But if it's old compared to the future, it's not surprising compared to the future, then it has spread, right? And then it tries to look at what characterizes a novel and resonating speech, which I think could be very easily, with some work, applied to scientific discourse, right? And yeah, I'm not going to cover this because we're done. So on Friday, we will take some of these ideas and do group brainstorm and operationalization of ideas for a project. It's not that you need to work on science of science. It's just an exercise to throw out ideas and develop them. And then next week, we'll do network and all. Next week is not next week because next week there's cognitive neuroscience. But in 2 weeks, next week of lectures, we're going to do networks. Thanks, and sorry for the 2 minutes.